Hey again, everyone. So I am going to take you through the steps for mixed media stitching now. So we started with our first video, which was laying the ground layer and deciding on your materials and gathering your materials and things like that. And now we are going to get into the actual stitching part, and I'm going to take you through kind of my intuitive process to stitching a piece from start to finish. And this probably will have some different backgrounds. So this is going to be, session 1, for example, and I will speed up some of the sessions and show you different angles and things like that so that you get a good overall view of how I do the process. And I will also show you the finishing process while I'm at it. So here we go. You now need your 3 layers, as we talked about in video 1, and if you have not yet watched video 1, then I would, I'll link it down below and you can go have a watch of it first, just to know what materials you need. But you've got your base layer here, and you're gonna face your base layer outwards. So the nice fabric, the good part of the fabric will be facing outwards, okay? And so towards you will be the inside of the fabric. Next, you are going to be placing your batting layer. And like I said, your batting can be many different things. This is a polyester batting, so it's very, very thick and fluffy, which is what I was going for these pieces. And then you're going to take your top piece and lay it out. You want to try to make it fairly straightforward, but all of these edges are going to be trimmed. So you don't need to worry about all the edges matching or anything like that, because eventually they're all going to be trimmed off and made nice and even. So now that we've got our 3 layers together, we're going to baste them. There are a couple of different ways you can baste. You can either use bobby pins, or you can use thread and thread across this entire thing very loosely, just to hold the 3 layers together in place. Or you can use a spray based. I don't use that method because I try to avoid adding in more glue or using anything kind of more toxic-y other than what I'm already using with the paint. And so this time I'm going to be using the safety pins, because they're kind of easier to deal with and to take out when you need to. So what you want to do is start in the middle, push your pin down through all 3 layers, and go out from there. And as you're doing it, you want to just make sure that you're making your fabric as flat as possible and not leaving ridges and things like that, because the ridges will make things pucker and make things not look as nice in your piece. All right. Okay, you can see now that I've gotten this area basted. You don't need to worry too much about making the pins even, especially when you're doing a small piece like this. And you can see, if you look at the back, that all of the pins have gone all the way through all 3 layers. So the layers are all securely put towards each other. And as I add the stitching, I'm going to be able to take out these pins because the fabric will kind of hold together by itself once the stitching has gone through it. All right, so now I need to make some decisions. I have quite an assortment, as you can see, of different threads here. I have regular thread. So this one, for instance, is I believe this one is a 40 weight. So you can see the thickness of a 40 weight versus the thickness of this is also 40 weight. And then I have these ones, I brought 40 all around. And then I have, these are old threads. And so these ones have a bit of a silky finish to them, and they're on wooden spools. And I tend to use these vintage threads only in hand stitching and only on art pieces because I wouldn't want to put them through my machine. because I really don't know if they're sturdy enough at this point to deal with a machine, but they definitely can handle hand stitching. And they can fray a little bit and be a little finicky, so you just have to be careful with those. And then I have an assortment of the same embroidery floss that we talked about in the first video. And there's lots of different brands, but this is a DMC, for example, and then there's also Anchor. I know of those two different brands at least that you can use for embroidery floss. The only other thing that I have is my thimbles, and you might want thimbles as well. Going through something like this is not going to be that hard on your fingers, but once you get used to stitching by hand, you may want to use a thimble to move through. So I actually put two on. I put one on my thumb, one on my middle finger, but a lot of people will just wear them on one finger and push the needle through with one hand and bring it up with their thumb afterwards. But I kind of stitch. I'm definitely a self-taught. I did learn how to quilt from someone specifically, but I do it in my own way, and I do large stitches. So I'm not going for the traditional tiny little stitches. Usually they would try to get 6 to 8 stitches per inch. Not my thing. I'm going for big stitches here, as you will see. Okay, so now I have to try to decide what I am going to do here, like how I'm going to begin. And beginning is probably the hardest part on something like this, because you have to kind of pick a color and pick a theme and kind of go with it. Like, you could definitely pick out the stitches if you started and you didn't like them, but I don't tend to do that. It's very rare that I do that. What I do is I just go, I start, and if I'm not happy with the way a stitch looks in an area, I will cover it with more stitches usually. So I think for me today, I'm going to start with this cream floss, and I'm going to do the entire light colored portions of the labyrinth. So I'm just going to stitch a single line down the middle of all of these lines around the labyrinth, and that's going to be where I begin, and then I'm going to reassess and go from there. If you're wondering how long to cut your thread, I tend to cut it to about the length of my tips of my fingers to my elbow, and that's just, I don't know, that's just what I tend to cut it. Sometimes I'll cut it shorter than that, but that's what I tend to do. I'm also going to separate these threads. So you can see there's 6 threads in each strand, and I'm only going to do 2, just because I want to start off with kind of thinner lines. So you basically just pull when you're taking this apart, like so. Sometimes these threads can get kind of jumbled or something like that, but for the most part I find that pretty rare. They come apart pretty easily. And then I'll set this one aside, and so you'll get 3 lengths out of this of 2 strands. Okay. Now, when you're choosing needles, there are specific quilting needles, and I don't necessarily use them for this type of quilting because they're very tiny and they are really for regular thread. So I tend to use a larger needle, and I actually couldn't even tell you what type of a needle this is, but hopefully just by seeing it you can find one similar in your supplies. And then I do make a knot at the end. I know some people don't, but I do. So the size of the knot, it doesn't have to be large, but it does have to catch on the inside. So when you are creating your, or starting off, you're going to put your needle in through the back. It doesn't really matter where you come up. So I'm pulling that through. And then you can see here that the knot is on this side. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna pull, and what's gonna happen is it's gonna go through this back fabric, but it's not gonna come out through this fabric. So it's stuck in the middle, in between the layers, and that's exactly where I want the knot to be. I am gonna put on my thimbles for this. And I'm also gonna take out this first pin that I put in because I wanna just start right at the beginning. Okay, so when you are starting your stitching, you want to try to make, well, I like to try to make my stitches as even as I can. You'll notice I'm not using any type of a hoop here. It's very tiny. You could use a hoop to keep it flat, but what's gonna happen is it's gonna be trickier to do that rocking back and forth motion of stitching that I do when I'm quilting something like this. So what you want to be able to do is push your needle through a couple of times. I usually try to do 3 or 4. So you can see here that I've tried to make this distance equal. Again, you don't have to do that, especially when you're learning. Don't worry too much about it being equal, unless that's something that's really important to you in the overall design. And then you can always only do a couple stitches at a time, whatever makes that more easier for you. So you can see there are my 3 stitches. I'm going to push it through with my back finger and pull. And there you have the beginnings. Sorry, it is a little bit hard to see the cream on this fabric. I maybe should have picked a contrasting thread for you. So now I'm just going to keep going until I get up here to the center of the labyrinth. Okay, so you can see I'm almost finishing this. So there's a couple different ways that I can go here. What I'm going to do is run the thread underneath the top layer until I get out to this point here where I started. Now you might be saying you could have just started in the center right here, and I could have. I just didn't really think that far in advance. So now I'm going to just travel all along and fill out this whole row the whole way through. So I just got to the end of my thread, and I just wanted to go over that with everybody in case they need to know. So when you get to the end of your thread, you're going to flip over your piece. You're going to tie a knot in the last remaining. So leave, I don't know, leave 1.5 inches, I think, of thread is probably the best amount. And tie a knot like this. Okay, and then you're going to rethread your needle, and you're going to pull the knot in again the same way you did when you were starting. And then it's nice and tucked under there. There we go. You can hear that snap. And then you just clip off the end. And then it has a nice finish to it. So this is the end of the stitching for this little piece. I decided to fill in these little shapes with kind of a grid pattern, and I also did some stitching on the crows, just like adding one more layer of texture to them. And that is that. So you can see that the shapes that you choose when you're stitching really depend upon a few things. The dimensionality that you want to come. So I always wanted the crows to be the most in the foreground. And these shapes, I could have filled them all in, but that would have made the labyrinth, you know, really stand out prominently as the lightest thing. And I thought that giving these shapes a bit of background dimension would add, you know, a more interesting dynamic to it. So that is the way I chose that, and I could have done some stitching over top of these. That would have taken a bit more time, and at this stage these pieces need to be getting done, so I decided to leave them as they are, like this. Alright, so now you have seen from start to finish a piece done in mixed media stitch, and I will be back again to share with you how to get started with mixed media stitch if you are interested in doing so with paper stitching instead of fabric and quilt stitching. Alright, thanks so much for watching, and I will be back again soon.